I'm going to talk to you a little bit about molds based on the presentation that you took notes from. And we'll talk about the different types of molds and different materials that molds can be made from and what works and what doesn't work. So I'm going to start with just like the traditional plaster mold. So this mold could actually be used one of two ways. It could be used as a press mold where we press the clay into the mold. You can see the bowl-like form that the clay will take the shape of. You could also flip this over and use it as a hump mold. And you can see that if you were to place clay on the surface of the bottom and use it as a hump mold, that the bowl would probably be wider and shallower than if you were to use the inside of it. But if you do choose to use a plaster mold, before you begin, make sure that you clean out any clay crumbs or anything on the surface of the mold, and you can just use a sponge and water to clean it off. So if I have some gray clay pieces in here, I definitely don't want to leave that on there if I'm going to use terracotta clay. So make sure that you clean it off. From there, even if the even if the plaster is a little bit damp, you can still begin to place clay in it, and it'll dry up quickly and it will be fine. So this is your typical plaster mold. You can use other things, household items, like just bowls that you have at home as a mold, like these. You could also even use Tupperware as a mold. So you can get some different shapes within the form of your pottery. So the one thing I want you to look at is the size though. All of these molds are at least about the size of my hand. So anything that you bring in from home should be roughly the size of your hand, or it's just plain too small. Okay, so again, I could use these either way, as a hump mold or as a press mold. Again, in the presentation, I talk about how plastic or really any like shinier surfaces that are sealed are going to keep moisture in the clay more than a plaster mold. So you want to make sure that you don't spray your clay as you're putting it in on a daily basis. And maybe even like if you put this in a bag, you just kind of place the bowl in the bag and not even close the bag, because the moisture will be held in there. If you're going to use a household item like this, especially one that's glossy, make sure that you have a dry mold to begin with. So this has water in it from being washed out because there's some gray clay in it. Make sure before you start at all that you completely dry it out. If you were to set clay in it and it was wet, that water would be trapped between the clay and the surface of the bowl, and it would just take a really long time to dry, and we would not have time to wait that long. Oops. So make sure it's dry before you begin putting any clay in or on it. So you can see, you use it either way. Things that do not work, any vessel. So a vessel is an object that is hollow on the inside. Any vessel that is really tall is really difficult to get the clay out of after it's been sitting in the mold. So we want to go for more of shallower objects, shallower bowls, rather than tall, skinny areas that it's going to be really tight in there and hard to get the clay back out of. Okay, so you can see all of these are fairly shallow, just a couple inches tall at most. Something like this will not work. So make sure that you choose your mold wisely. You can bring in something from home, or you can borrow a plaster mold from the back of the classroom.